And we're back on your essays. You folks are doing a really nice job, and I can see how for many of you, you're getting more and more comfortable writing these essays. Um, because what you're trying to do in these essays is give us your thoughts, your opinions on things. And so I think you should be able to relax and write these. And actually, it seemed like some of you were finally starting to relax in this last round of essays. Um, I understand you're putting your thoughts out there for everybody to read, but what's really important is what your thoughts are and the way that you present your thoughts. So, um, just relax and be honest and kind of enjoy sharing your thoughts. Okay. Most of you, when you're writing comments, are getting quite specific. There's still a few of you that are saying, yeah, I really agree with what you said, and not a lot more than that. I think I'd like you to be a little more detailed in that. Try to add a little bit something in your comment other than just, oh yeah, it was good kind of thing. So, but overall, I'm very pleased with what you're doing. Um, Behind me, over my shoulder here, are a bunch of the medals that I've gotten, a few of the medals that I've gotten from a bunch of the different marathons that I've done, because I've done a lot of those. But it's kind of fun to talk a minute about them. One of my favorites actually is this one right here. This is, as you can see, this is Goofy, and the Goofy is obviously done in Disney World, no surprise. And to do the Goofy, you run a half a marathon on Saturday, so 13.1 miles on Saturday, and then on Sunday you run a full marathon, 26.2. Okay, and the kind of the joke behind it is you have to be goofy to do it, so you get the Goofy medal when you're running a half and a full back to back. Yeah, it's fun. It's just fun, and Disney does such a great job. And so you see some of the other ones that I've done here, and there's some from Buffalo and some other Disneys. And one of my favorites is this one right here. This is from Big Sur Marathon, and Big Sur goes right along the Pacific coast. It's incredibly beautiful. You're either running through Redwood Forest or you're running right along the Pacific Ocean from up above. And it is just so beautiful. The whole thing is beautiful. Incredibly difficult. Mile 10 to 12 is an amazing 2 mile hill. I mean, killer 2 mile hill. Okay. But then you get past 12 and you go over this long, long bridge. And on the other side of the bridge, you get to the halfway mark in the marathon, 13.1 miles. And believe it or not, there's a guy dressed in a tuxedo playing a grand piano at the halfway point. They bring in the grand piano on a helicopter, so it's really a cool experience. Anyway, that's what this stuff is over my shoulder. Okay, so now this week we want to talk about the concept of narration in literature. Okay, an important point that I need to make with you right away is this. The narrator is a created character. The narrator is a character in a piece of literature. The author is the person who writes the piece of literature. But in your typical piece of fiction, it is not the author that is speaking to you. It is not the author who is speaking to you. It is the narrator. The narrator is the one who is telling us the story. Okay? The author creates the narrator. The narrator tells the story. A lot of people are confused by that. A lot of people view it as if the author is telling us the story. That's not the case. And that whole case is muddied by the reaction that people had to Edgar Allan Poe's short stories. because in Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, he usually had a narrator who was speaking from the point of view of I, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Speaking from the point of view of I, okay? So, the narrator was almost like the narrator was part of the story and telling you, the reader, exactly as this narrator was um, experiencing the story, okay? Um, and so Poe's narrators often were drug addicts or drunks or people who were crazy, things like this, okay? That's what a lot of his narrators were. Poe was also a literary critic. And in his literary criticisms, he was blatantly honest. If somebody wrote something that he thought was really not very good at all, he was willing to say it was not very good at all. And so some authors got mad at him, and a lot of these authors who got mad at him also functioned as literary critics, where they would write things about other people's materials and other people's pieces of writing. And so Poe offended some of these people, I guess, and so they wanted to get even with him. And so when they acted as literary critics about Poe's work, they'd go out of their way to make it seem as if the narrator was really Edgar Allan Poe, when in fact his narrators were created characters. So these guys in their criticisms would say things like, that old drunk Poe, Well, Poe had an allergic condition. He was allergic to alcohol. The smallest amount of alcohol would incapacitate him for many days, okay? So he was not a heavy drinker. And again, his reaction to alcohol was an allergy, and it would make him really violently ill for a number of days, okay? And there's almost no evidence that Poe ever used drugs of any kind. Okay? And Poe certainly was not a crazy person. He was an incredibly imaginative person who wrote great things. But again, because of Poe and Poe's style of writing, and others like him, not just Poe, the concept of the author and the narrator are often confused. So I'm going to repeat this to you again. The author writes the story. The author does not tell us the story. The author writes the story, and the author creates a narrator to tell us the story. So if you look at A Rose for Emily, Faulkner was not in that town, okay? But Faulkner created a narrator, kind of like the whole town put together. And they're the ones that told us that story, okay? The town itself was a made-up town, but Faulkner created that narrator to tell us the story. In The Story of an Hour, we have a narrator who tells us the story. The narrator tells us what's going on. It's not the author who tells us what's going on. It is the narrator. The author writes the thing and then puts the narrator to work to tell it, basically. Okay, two different things. So author, narrator in fiction, two very different things. Narrator, created character. Okay, so we have two principal kinds of narrators, and each of those two kinds breaks down into subcategories. Okay? First, we have a first-person narrator. The first-person narrator is generally telling us the story from the point of view of I or we. Okay? So the narrator, in a sense, is a part of the story. The narrator is a part of the story and tells it to us as if he is a part of the story because he's using the terms I and we. So if we look again at A Rose for Emily, the narrator was actually a collective narrator. The townspeople telling us all about this strange person in their town, Emily. Okay, so again, the narrator talked to us from the point of view of we. Okay? We didn't get any I in there. We got we. Okay, so that was a first person narrator, and a narrator who does it as did that one in A Rose for Emily is called a collective narrator, collective first person narrator. That collective first person narrator is giving us, in a sense, is the voices of a collection of people. So collective first person narrator. Okay, and so what we hear comes from the voice of this collection of people. This we is a collection. Okay, so that's a collective first person narrator. Okay, there's also an omniscient first person narrator, and the word omniscient means all knowing. God is omniscient. God is all knowing. Omniscient, if you break the word down to its Latin base, omni means all, and scio is the Latin verb for to know. Okay, so this person is all knowing. This person is omniscient. This person knows everything, and it's talking from the point of view of I, and knows everything that's going on. Knows everything about everybody. They know everything. Okay. Then we can have a semi-omniscient narrator. So a semi-omniscient narrator knows almost, but not all, everything. Okay, he's more than just a narrator, as in the narrator for A Rose for Emily. Obviously, there were a lot of things that narrator did not know. Okay, but we get a narrator that knows almost everything. Okay, so we can have a collective first person. We can have an omniscient first person. We can have a semi-omniscient first person, and then we can have a narrator that you might say is unreliable. A first-person narrator who's telling us the story, but almost seems a little bit slanted in trying to get across opinions to us, almost like the typical news program that you watch today. You know, if you watch news on television, you of course realize that the newscasters are always trying to intermix some opinion with the stories. So you can watch CNN News if you lean really far left, so far that you almost fall over. CNN News has been dubbed the Clinton News Network because obviously very left-leaning people. And you can hear the same story from Fox News, and Fox News is a very conservative, very right-leaning kind of news story. So you can hear the same story from two different perspectives, okay? And the truth probably lies somewhere in between. Each of them is trying to get their kinds of feeling, their opinions mixed in with the news, so we believe it. So most of the news we get is coming from an unreliable first-person narrator, the person who's acting as if they experience this stuff or acting as if they really know it, and so they've heard about it and they're opinionating a bit for us. Okay, so that's an example of an unreliable first-person narrator. Okay, then there's a third-person narrator. So the one big category, first big category was first person, and then the second big category is third person. And a third person narrator generally is talking to us from the point of view of he, she, it, they, them, theirs. Okay? And so the story of an hour is a third person narrative. Okay? The person telling us the story is not involved in the story. It's like that person is an observer, standing back and telling us what he or she sees. That's a third person narrator. Okay? And we have subcategories of third person narrators. Now, you can have a third person narrator who knows everything, just as you can have a first-person narrator who knows everything. So the third-person narrator knows everything that's going on. It's kind of like, you know, your mother. Your mother always knows everything, even though she doesn't act like it. Okay, that's a third-person narrator. She were to tell a story about you, okay? And of course, she wouldn't give all the details if it were not a happy story, because she wouldn't want to give out all the details about you. But anyway, beside the point. Okay, so we can have an omniscient third-person narrator, a narrator who knows everything. We can have a semi-omniscient third-person narrator, just like the semi-omniscient first-person narrator. The semi-omniscient third-person narrator acts like they know everything, but they don't really, okay? For instance, in the story of an hour, we have a semi-omniscient third-person narrator there. We have the narrator telling us the story, telling us this happened and this happened and this happened, except the narrator doesn't really even know all the details. This narrator doesn't even know what was really going on with Mrs. Mallard. And this narrator left us hanging. This narrator doesn't really know why Mrs. Mallard died. Did she die because she was overjoyed that her husband walked in the door? Did she die because she was shattered when her husband walked into the door? Now, the narrator at the end tells us the joy that kills, okay? But we don't know really what killed Mrs. Mallard. Was it the shock of seeing her husband and you know, it's like, oh my God? Or was it the joy of seeing him? Or was it joy left over from thinking she was free? We don't know, okay? And that's because the narrator didn't know. Okay? So that's a narrator that knows most things but not everything. So that would be a semi-omniscient third-person narrator. And then again, we get an unreliable third-person narrator. So a narrator who kind of tells us a story with a little bit of personal opinion attached. Okay, so that's kind of what our narrators are all about. And again, keep in mind that the author and the narrator are two separate things. Okay, author writes it, narrator tells it. And also, you can read third-person narration pieces of fiction and have characters in that narrative talking to each other, okay? So a character may say to somebody else, yes, I really think this. That doesn't make it first-person narration. It's the third-person narrator telling you what this person said. So just because a character in a story says, if it's not the narrator that's saying that, then it's not first-person narration, okay? It's just a dialogue. It's just discussion, okay? So you guys are doing a great job. Again, two major categories, first-person narrator, third-person narrator, subsets of each. And keep the concept of the author and the narrator separated. The author is the writer who creates the narrative, okay? Great work. Looking forward to your essays again this week.